Hi, I'm Grace, and this is the very first video of Grace Teaches. Feel free to watch my introduction video if you want to know a little bit more about me and my intents for this channel, but today we're going to talk about Palestine and Israel. Most people have seen, at the very least, mentions of the tragedy happening. Maybe you've seen it on the news, maybe your social media feed, maybe even your colleagues at work are talking about it. A lot of this information can be really overwhelming, especially if one group is telling you to take one side and another group is telling you to take another side, and you want to support a side, but you're not sure if it's the right side, and you're not sure if the information that you're hearing is true or biased. You might have already tried to Google it, and you might see answers like it's complicated or it's a long history. Both of these answers are true. And if you do find information online, it's probably really confusing or hard to read for a lot of people, and that's okay. The truth is that the history of these two countries would take hours for anybody to share, but that doesn't mean that it isn't important for it to be shared. In this video, I might gloss over details, I might forget something, I probably will definitely paraphrase, so please feel free to comment if there is something that you believe needs to be said that I have missed. But I hope that this video will help people better understand what is happening right now in these two countries. So here is a summary of the conflicts between Palestine and Israel. To give much needed context to this conflict, we're going to start at the beginning. And when I say the beginning, I mean the Bible. Now, in no way am I claiming that the events that happen in the Bible are fact, but it is important context. You've probably heard the phrase the promised land at some point. This is referring to the land of Canaan, which is the land that was promised by God to Abraham and his descendants in the Bible. If you were to put Canaan on today's map, it would cover most of Israel and Palestine, plus parts of Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan. Now, in Canaan, there was a severe drought. This led Jacob, aka Israel, and 12 of his sons to migrate from Canaan to Egypt. Multiple events happened, which led to the Israelites being enslaved by Egyptians for a very, very, very long time. This lasted until Moses was born, who God demanded release the Israelites from slavery in Egypt and bring them back to the land of Canaan. More events happened, which lead to Moses, right before he died, giving authority over to Joshua to lead this movement. So Joshua is the one who led the Israelites into Canaan to conquer it, starting with the fall of Jericho. So the Israelites took over most of Canaan until they founded the United Monarchy, which eventually split up into Israel in the north and Judah in the south. Now, this is where I'm definitely going to paraphrase some. There's definitely thousands of years of history to be covered. I can't cover everything in this one video. But lots of events happened. Specifically, there was 2 exiles in both Israel and Judah, which led to the Israelites and the Judeans to be forced out of their homes. The lands fell to different powers until it was conquered by the Ottoman Empire in 1516. Fast forward to the 1800s. To put it simply, but not lightheartedly by any means, Jewish people were being killed in many places like Eastern Europe. To avoid this violence, there was a huge wave of Jewish immigration to Ottoman Palestine called the First Aliyah. The First Aliyah started in 1881 when the population of Jewish people in Ottoman Palestine was only about 3%. Now, in response to all of the anti-Semitism that Jewish people were facing at the time, in 1896, a Jewish journalist published the founding papers of Zionism, which basically states that the solution to anti-Semitism, especially in Europe, was to create a state for Jewish people. By 1903, the Jewish population in Ottoman Palestine rose from 26,000 to about 55,000 people. Now, the Ottoman Empire did try to place some restrictions on Jewish immigration, which led to some tension, of course, but Jewish people were still given the same rights as Arabs. They were allowed to buy land, buy homes. By 1914, that 3% Jewish population had rose to 7% with the second Aliyah, and the tensions just keep growing. When the Ottoman Empire was destroyed, the new powers essentially split up the territories into what we call mandates, and the goal of the mandates was for the new powers to provide assistance and advice until they could stand on their own. So Britain was assigned the Mandate of Palestine in 1920, which does include what we now call the Land of Israel. Now, I mentioned Zionism before. If you're unsure what that is, it's defined as an ethno-nationalism movement, which believes that people of shared heritage should have their own state. So basically, the Jewish people believe that they should have their own state, Israel. Now, just 3 years prior to the Mandate of Palestine in 1917, Britain released a Balfour Declaration, which was basically them supporting the establishment of a home for Jewish people in Palestine. This was a big deal because it was the first public endorsement of Zionism. Now, the declaration also says, to quote, "It being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine." So basically, leave people in Palestine who aren't Jewish alone. Then a little bit later, they say that they didn't mean all of Palestine. And then again, a little bit later in 1929, they agreed that the wishes and interests of the locals should have been taken into account when releasing the Balfour Declaration. But Zionist leaders still continued to advocate for support for their movement, especially to Britain. In 1936 to 1939, we have the very devastating Arab Revolt in Palestine. This was an uprising against the British administration. The goal for the revolt was independence from British colonial rule and to end the support of Britain for Zionism. It ended with almost 5,000 Palestinian Arabs killed and almost 500 Jews killed. Now, during this, Britain caused a lot of Palestine's political leadership to be driven into exile, but they also did reduce Jewish immigration. And then in 1939, the White Paper was released, which further introduced restrictions on Jewish immigration and actually declared the intent to give Palestine their independent state within the next 10 years. Despite all of this, World War II and the Holocaust happened, which gained the Zionist movement a lot of attention and sympathy. Now, we're going to really zoom in on our timeline. In August 1947, Zionist groups fought the British administration and blew up a Palestinian family home, killing 12 people, including a woman and 6 children. Right after this, in September 1947, the United Nations Partition Plan for Palestine was drafted and then adopted in November. So at this point, the world is trying to help them in this horrible conflict between Israel and Palestine. So the United Nations Partition Plan called for the end of the Mandate Territory. It called for the withdrawal of British troops from all of the areas. And then it was under the impression that soon after that, they would draw boundaries between Israel and Palestine. Sounds great, right? Here's the thing. Out of the entire Mandate Territory of Palestine, it declared that the Arabs would be allowed about 42% of it, and that the Jewish people would be allowed about 56% of it, and then the remaining percentage would go to Jerusalem and Bethlehem, which would become international zones. This is in despite of the fact that the Arabs outnumbered the Jewish population double the amount. In response, the Arabs striked. The strike lasted about 3 days, and tensions just really kept growing. Violence became more and more common. By January 1948, 333 Jews and 345 Arabs had been killed, many more injured. And then from December of 1947 to January of 1948, almost 70,000 Arabs had fled, and by March that number was 100,000. Flash forward to May of 1948, literally one day before the Mandate of Palestine would expire, the State of Israel, who was not the State of Israel at the time, declared the State of Israel. The US and the Soviet Union immediately recognized the State of Israel, but the Arab League did not. Over the next few days, more countries in the Arab League, like Egypt, Syria, Transjordan, Iraq, they invaded the Israeli forces, and then this prompted the UN to call for a ceasefire on May 29th. Neither side respected the truce. Only 28 days later, the Egyptian forces ended the ceasefire. During this time frame, there was almost 100,000 Palestinians who became refugees. The UN ended up declaring another ceasefire on July 18th. It lasted until September 16th, when they introduced a new partition plan, which both sides rejected. Egyptian forces and Israeli forces continued to clash, so the ceasefire ended again, and so they called a third truce in October. In defiance of this, the ALA units stormed an IDF position. Now, at first, Israel was hesitant to strike back because they didn't want to piss off the UN. So they just demanded that the ALA units remove themselves from the position. However, they did not. And so Israel was like, okay. And they were like, sorry, UN, we're going to have to piss you off, and they retaliated back. In December, Israel forced the Egyptian army into the Gaza Strip. However, they did withdraw after international pressure and after Britain threatening them, saying that they would intervene. In 1949, we have the Armistice Agreements, which is where they tried to draw territory lines again. However, the Jewish held 78% of the original mandatory Palestine territory, which is 22% more than the UN had initially allocated them in the first partition plan. In 1964, the PLO was established. The PLO is the Palestinian Liberation Organization. It's an internationally recognized representative of Palestinian people, both in the occupied territories of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, and of all of the Palestinian refugees who have not been able to come home. Now, initially, the PLO did want to establish an Arab state over all of mandatory Palestine, including over the Israel people. They did commit acts of violence against Israel. In June 1967, we have the Six-Day War. So Egypt is currently occupying the Gaza Strip, and Israel had issues with them over the Straits of Tiran, which just eventually led into Israel launching an offensive against the Gaza Strip. By the end, almost 15,000 Arabs had died, while the Jewish people only suffered about 1,000 casualties. Also, anywhere from 280,000 to 325,000 Palestinians fled or were expelled from the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. Now, in 1987, we have the first Intifada. An Intifada is basically a series of nonviolent protests, civil disobedience, but also things like attacks and riots led by civilians and militants. So this is when the US designated the PLO as a terrorist group. Now, you might have heard the word apartheid thrown around. I'm going to read you the definition. The crime of apartheid is defined as inhumane acts of a character similar to other crimes against humanity committed in the context of an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression and domination by one racial group over any other racial group or groups, and committed with the intention of maintaining that regime. A symptom of an apartheid is near total physical separation between the two groups, which we do see in the West Bank. I think it's important to note that Israel has received international condemnation for violating the human rights of Palestinians. Since the 1948 war, they have refused to let Palestinian refugees return, which is a violation of international law. After the PLO declared the state of Palestine, there was a ton of discourse over the next few years, drawing borders and convincing other countries to recognize the state of Palestine. In 1993, we do have the Oslo Accords, which did bring about a small era of peace. It called for the PLO to recognize the state of Israel and for Israel to recognize the PLO. An era of peace sounds great. However, the accords were opposed by many, many people. Israel and Hamas continued to attack each other, so it wasn't really this great era of peace that they thought it would be. An Israeli prime minister was even assassinated for signing them by an Israeli extremist. So this era of quote-unquote peace went on until 2000 with the Second Intifada, where the Israeli military re-entered a lot of the spaces that they had withdrawn from. In February of 2005, Palestine and Israel both announced a ceasefire, which Hamas endorsed. Hamas then went on to win the 2006 elections, which the US and Israel were very surprised by. The Quartet on the Middle East issued a formal statement congratulating Palestine, but said that future assistance to any new government would be reviewed by donors against that government's commitment to the principles of nonviolence, recognition of Israel, and acceptance of previous agreements and obligations. So they basically said, congratulations, but you better recognize Israel and you cannot attack anybody. Hamas rejected that and said that the unfair conditions would endanger Palestinians. And that sentiment was actually echoed by Saudi Prime Minister, who said that the European Union insisted on having elections in Palestine, and this is the result of what they asked for. Now to come around and say they don't accept the will of the people that was expressed through democratic means seems an unreasonable position to take. Now, in Palestine, there's Hamas and there's Fatah. You can kind of think of them as Republicans and Democrats. It's two political parties opposing each other. One of the big issues between them is that Hamas supports armed resistance against Israel and Fatah wants to defend the Oslo Accords. After Hamas was elected, Fatah basically refused to enter a unified government with them. So essentially now Hamas has control of the Gaza Strip and Fatah has control of the West Bank. Then in 2007, Israel imposed a blockade of the Gaza Strip. Internationally, this was condemned as a collective form of punishment, but Israel defended it, saying it was necessary to stop the Palestinian rocket attacks. Hamas took it as a declaration of war, so the fighting kept going. In 2014, Israel invaded Gaza in a major war that led to the death of 73 Israelis and 2,251 Palestinians. Clashes kept going until October of 2023 when Palestinian militants attacked Israel, resulting in the death of 1,143 Israelis and starting the Gaza war, which is what you see now. Israel responded by bombing the Gaza Strip and launching an invasion that has killed 61,000 Gazans as of August 2025, which is right now. Most of the world has already spoken out against Israel and labeled this war a genocide. The reason I chose this topic as the first video for this channel is because I want to make people aware of the death and destruction that is going on at the moment, and this is a situation that we need to focus on right now. It cannot wait. I'm going to put some resources and stuff in the description on ways that you can help the people of Palestine. Moving forward, my intention for Grace Teaches is to touch on a wide array of subjects such as history, politics, art, so please comment below anything that you would like to hear about. Thank you so much for watching and for listening, and most of all, free Palestine.